I'm V with Passions and Distractions, and we're back for part 2 of working with stencils. And this part of the series, I'm going to focus on one of my favorite things to do, which is embossing with stencils. Let me show you all the cool things you can do. Okay, so the first way I'm going to show you of embossing is with what's called styluses. So a stylus is just a pen or pencil shaped object, and that has this little ball tip on one end or the other. This one, as you can see, has a really fine ball tip on one end, slightly thicker on the other. I have this thicker kind of stylus, so it has like a really full ball tip on one end and a slightly finer ball tip on the other. Now really it's going to come down to a couple of things. One is what kind of stencils you're trying to emboss, what's comfortable, what's in your price point. I know that you can also use like a completely dried out, keep that in mind, pen and use that as your stylus. But the other thing that's going to depend on is what kind of stencil are you actually trying to emboss. So for example, I have this really, really nice metal stencil. It's from an old Martha Stewart set. And as you can see, it has a lot of really detailed points. It's got these little circles. It has these very fine leaves. So I'm probably going to want a finer stencil for this. I'm sorry, a finer stylus. If, on the other hand, you are using a bigger stencil like this, you see how it's got like these big wide lines. Well, now for me, I'm probably still going to go with this finer one so I can get all up in that corner. But you could just as easily go for your big chunky ball style stylus. Boy, that's going to be a thing all day, isn't it? Your big chunky stylus here. Now, in terms of actually tracing it, well, there's actually a couple of things I want you to keep in mind. Now, this one is going to be pretty much your most tedious way. There's one other way that I'm going to show you. It's going to be pretty time consuming as well. But you're going to want to factor that in when you pick a stencil. Just how much patience do you actually have? Do you have more like this amount of patience, where it's just a bunch of big obvious rectangles and you're going to quickly spot what you missed and you move on? Do you have this kind of patience, where there's a very, very ornate design? The other thing that I want you to keep in mind is how well it's going to resist when you're actually stenciling with it. So, obviously, this is metal. It's going to be really firm. It's going to resist really well. This one, you can certainly use this, but see how much more flexible that is. See how, it's literally a thinner plastic. And it's got a bunch of these fine lines. Now this one, is maybe not my best example because they are really still well connected. So it's probably not going to like bend under as you press it. It's not really going to shift. But some of the stencils I've seen, they have very fine, long, wavy lines and they're only connected at either end. That may not be your best one for embossing. This one, once again, it's a thicker plastic. It has these nice thick areas, in between each rectangle. This one is going to hold up really well to the stylus embossing. So don't be afraid to experiment, but know that you may have to experiment and your first idea may not work out. So what I'm going to use is I'm going to use a light box. Now, unfortunately, because of my camera mounting system here, I can't show you the full thing. Just trust that it's a light box. It says it's a light box. It's got a little pencil holder at the top. Also keep in mind that as I show this to you, it's going to be a little bit difficult for you to see because it's camera pointed directly at a light source. So there are limitations. You can do this sort of embossing if you tape the stencil and your piece of paper to a window on a bright day. I am cranky and impatient and don't like to wait for bright days, and I don't like to stand there, working off of a window. So that's not how I roll. I have a light box. I use it for a few different things. But just keep in mind, if that's not something you want to invest in, you have some resources. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this on. It needs just a moment to kind of warm up like that. And then here is the card front that I'm using, and there is the design that I'm going to use. So as you can see, as soon as I place that cardstock over it, it, shines right through. I'm able to see it. And actually what I'm going to do in this case, I'll put the cardstock down first. I'm going to center the design over it, pretty much center. And then I'm just going to go ahead and tape this down. Now in this particular case, I probably wouldn't necessarily have to do this, but I don't want to take a chance on anything shifting. And certainly with a finer stencil, one with a lot more detail, I would definitely want to be mindful of that. So now I've got that taped down. You want to make sure that it doesn't overlap the stencil itself. And then flip it over so your stencil is on the back. Now just grab your stylus. I'm using this fine points ball stylus. Actually, I'm going to use this because that's the finer point. And all you're going to do is you're going to start just tracing along the edge of that stencil. Okay, so I have finished tracing this, and as you can see, we have a nice subtle embossed pattern. All I did was take the stencil off, flip it over, and now we have that nice raised surface. Now we'll talk about different things that you can do with this raised surface later, but for now let me show you more ways to emboss. So the next technique involves these Ranger embossing pens. Now these come in clear and they come in black. Depending on what embossing powder you're using, depending on what color you need it to be. If you're doing a more intricate pattern, you might want to go with the black just so you can see where you've been. I'm going to show this to you with a really simple pattern for now, so I'm just going to keep it in clear. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to prep your surface just like you would for any other embossing. Because basically this is just putting some embossing ink right onto your surface. You're going to sprinkle the powder on. You've seen me do embossing before. So now I'm going to put this design right over here in the corner. I think in this case I will go ahead and I'll tape it down just because I don't want it to shift. I'm just going to put a little bit up here. That should be enough. When I dump the embossing powder, I'll try to make sure I stay away from any stickiness that might be left there. And then I'm just going to go in and trace my design. So I'm just going to do one circle. So now I have that traced on there. If you look really closely, you might be able to see like the slightest glint of it. But like I said, that's just applying the ink. So then you just want to sprinkle your embossing powder on there, just like you would with any other embossing product. And as you see, I have this lovely fine design, and then I'm just going to heat it up and treat it just like any other embossing. And there you have it, a very lovely embossed design. So now we're going to do another version of that idea, except this time we're going to apply the ink directly from the pad through the stencil onto the paper. So once again, you want to prep your surface just like you always do when you're embossing. You're just prepping it with this little talc or cornstarch packet. I've already taped my stencil, so I'm just flipping it over. Now, if I wanted only a specific section of this design to show, I would actually go ahead and I would tape that off before I start mushing the stencil through. That's not actually what I'm going to worry about today. Today, I'm just going to do something that's kind of haphazard and fun. So as you can see, I'm just pressing it through. I'm kind of keeping a general idea of where I've pressed. I'm kind of keeping it in line with the grid lines, just kind of keeping an eye on it. I'm pressing down pretty firmly because I want to make sure there's enough ink to actually catch the embossing powder. But I'm not being super persnickety here. You know, I'm actually going for a pretty relaxed look on this. Just kind of however it comes out is however it comes out. It's not going to be, at least in this case, the exact stencil. So I think I have that pretty well covered. I'm seeing maybe a couple of areas where I don't really see much glare. So I'm gonna pick that up. While I don't mind it being loose and easy, I don't want it completely messed up. And then, of course, I pull away the stencil, and you can see that I have at least a fair amount of the stencil on there. Hopefully you can see that. Definitely, when I sprinkle the powder on, you're going to be able to see it then. So now, as you can see, because I used embossing enamel, the finish is very thick and in some cases not really as smooth as embossing powder. That might be user error. You know, I haven't used this a lot. It was one of the first embossing things I purchased. And let's just put it this way, I didn't really know what I was buying. So, you know, it still came out with a pretty great result though, and I would still happily trim this down, use it as a background. I think there's still plenty of opportunity to put a sentiment on here and have something really shiny and magnificent. Let's show you what's next. So the next way that I'm going to show you to emboss with a stencil is actually using your die cutting machine. So if you have something like a Gemini, Spellbinders, things like that, they can all emboss your stencil. The thing is that you're going to want to pay attention to recommendations in the user manual, you know, online. You know, there's a few different places where you can find out the best sandwich for your machine. So I've already constructed my sandwich here, so let's see what happens. All right, and as you can see, when I pull away the stencil, I have a very nice embossed surface. So you need to decide when you're embossing, do you want, which side you want embossed. And I say that because you want to make sure that you put the tape on the right side. This is now going to be a little bit of a tender moment as I pull this off. I'm just trying to be gentle here. I don't want to lift away a layer of paper. So in my mind, I had envisioned the embossed part being the lines. Clearly that's not going to happen because my washi tape was a little too sticky and I'm already pulling away a little bit of the paper. So learn from me. I didn't think that one through. So just to cover real quick, what I did for mine, for the Gemini, is I put down the clear cutting plate, the plastic shim, my stencil, my item that I wanted stenciled. Then I put down the embossing mat. Then I actually went ahead and used the metal shim as well, just to make it as thick as possible. You know, it's a pretty wibbly wobbly kind of stencil. I'm just using basic thin cardstock. and then I've put on the top clear plate. So that's what I used for the Gemini cutter that I have. But like I said, you know, check your manuals, recommendations, check online. Other people have, I guarantee other people have done what you've done, or what you're trying to do. So don't make this unnecessarily hard on yourself. But look at how fantastic that is. Ooh. So I did promise that I'd be sharing some ways to sass up these embossings. So the first one that I want to show you is where you basically just scrape an ink pad across the embossed surface. And you're just doing this very, very gently. Now keep in mind there's a couple of things that you can do. You can place the stencil back over it, and that helps make sure the ink only gets on the surface of the embossed part. In my case, I used a metal stencil for this one. It's pretty thick. That's not going to be my most effective thing. The other option, of course, is that you can just embrace that it's gonna have kind of a shabby chic vibe. That's what I'm going for today, so I'm perfectly comfortable with that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hold the ink pad upside down, pray that I don't drop it, and then very gently lower it until it just kisses the surface. Then applying just the slightest pressure, I'm just dragging it across. And you see how the color starts to land only on the embossed sections. So let's go at it again from this side. You just want to be really gentle. Like I said, you're not going to get even coverage. And then some of the ink is going to end up on parts that were not embossed. Some of the ink may not end up on parts that were embossed. You know, this is, you know, a vibe that you have to embrace. You know, if you want something that is more refined, I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do that. But you also might just want to consider a stencil that has, you know, a little, you know, like this one is still a pretty thick stencil, but it also has these open spots. So if I drag this along, I would do a pretty good job of covering it, and the stencil's not so thick that it would actually hit all the embossed parts. But, you know, I think there's something to be said for embracing this. I mean, this reminds me of the rubbings that people would do. I've done a few of those. You know, you go to, you know, a cemetery, or you go to a monument and you do a rubbing of whatever's etched in there. I've just shown you my secret goth side. As I ink a butterfly pink, let me tell you about the times I did rubbings at cemeteries. Yes, this matches. Let me show you what else you can do. So of course some techniques can just be applied across the board as always, and one of them is the fact that when you emboss, it creates this nice little line that helps contain whatever you put in there. Now I am still not a great watercolorer. I don't see that changing anytime soon. So off camera I traced one of the stencils with the Ranger marker in black actually. Added some black embossing powder, which is an older powder, so as you can see, like some of the lines are a little bit thicker and it's a little bit, you know, maybe not my best work, but still great for an experiment, and it'll definitely look better once I add some watercolor. There you have it. Now it still needs to dry some. I may go back later, I may add a little bit more color, but as you can see, you know, I've already gotten this great look, and this is a great way for me to use my stencils, use them in a different way, but kind of work around challenges that I have as an artist. Now another thing that you can do is actually coat the stencil itself in ink, and then when you emboss it, you're going to have kind of a letterpress effect because it's going to press the ink into the cardstock. So let me show you. So now that I have that thoroughly inked, I'm going to go ahead and place it on my sandwich, and then I'm gently laying this piece right on top. Now you can see it's off center. I really, in this case, while I am quite annoyed at myself for getting it off center, I'm not going to try to shift it because that's going to make the ink smear. I'm also going to go ahead and take another piece of paper. Now I'm just going to lay down my rubber mat, lay down this other, and I'm just going to run it through. And as you can see, this is the effect you get. So you see how the ink is actually pressed down into the surface. So see, this would be your embossed side. And now you have this ink pressed in, and you get this really great letter press effect. You know, now applying this to the stencil, depending on the stencil, you may come out with a blotchier or smoother finish. Like you see, this is not perfectly smooth. I'm perfectly okay with that. And the fact that I didn't get it centered, I'm okay with that too. I'll just trim it down. I'll square it off, you know, post-production, so to speak. But I do now have a beautiful, intricate, embossed piece, all from one of my stencils. Now don't forget, I haven't mentioned it through this process, but every time you use your stencils, make sure that you're cleaning them off. I want to clean off this ink. It may not all come off, that's okay. You know, I cleaned the other stencils after I pressed the Versamark in there, or I traced around it with the pen. You just want to do as much as you can to keep your stencils clean. As with all of your craft products, you know, some staining is inevitable, but the more that you do to keep it pristine, the better effects you'll have out of it. So I also have this piece that I embossed, and you can see, you know, it's that basket weave stencil I've shown on here a couple of different times. And you flip it over, and I don't know how well you can see them, but there are actually little wells in here from the embossing. You know, that's the debossed side. Now, once again, I did this on watercolor paper, and what I wanted to do was use these little wells to my advantage again. So I'm just going to pick a well at random, and I'm just going to touch the paint in. So this is kind of helping to hold the paint in. This one's maybe a little bit more saturated than I probably should have done because it is overflowing a little bit. So let's take another one. If you just press it into the center and then kind of work it out to the sides, it shouldn't really overflow, and you start getting that nice effect. You'll start getting, once again, that nice basket weave or whatever the particular stencil is. You'll start getting that look without having to use the stencil and rely on your watercolor skills, which, you know, once again, as I've demonstrated, I don't have a whole ton of. Now, I'm not going to paint all of this on camera. This is actually a pretty complex stencil. Even though it's very simple, it's just a bunch of rectangles, there's still a bunch of rectangles. And this is going to take me a while and does require a lot of precision. But I want you to see how that works out. And you know, if you're using maybe a thicker stencil, although that one's a pretty thick stencil, or maybe you have a different weight of watercolor paper, kind of experiment around, see what you get in terms of different well depths. that might make this easier on you. For me, I'm never really one to shy away from a challenge, so this doesn't bother me too much. I just know that it's going to be pretty time consuming. You might or might not see the complete version of this on my blog. It depends on, frankly, how much patience I have. I maybe should have picked a simpler design for this experiment, but I really wanted to use that basket weave. So as I mentioned toward the beginning of this video, know thyself. And I clearly overestimated myself. But that's not looking too bad. I'll be excited to see what it looks like when it's dry. You know, like I said, you're seeing how you can just kind of press it down and it automatically starts filling out to the edges of the well. Yeah, that's going to be cool if I finish it. So this is part 2 of a series of things to do with stencils. Be sure to subscribe. Be sure to like the video. Leave a comment. Apparently all these things help some sort of magical algorithm. So if you thought it was useful, why don't you share the love and make sure that some other people get to see it too. You know, it's really hard for me to fulfill my dreams of world domination if people aren't really paying attention. So, you know, I'm just putting that out there. Bye for now.